This is our final class together of this school, and we have some faces here that have not been here during the week due to the Sabbath. So for some people, they may not have seen the progression of where we got to, the conclusions that we made, particularly in our last class. So I want, for their benefit and for ours, just to give a brief summary of what we've actually done at this school. We started off at this school by looking at the reform lines, and I wanted to focus on two. Wanted to focus on the reform line of the priests and the reform line of the world. And that's what we still have up on our board. This first reform line of the priesthood, and then this reform line of the agricultural model of the world, from their ploughing, early rain, latter rain, and then we focused in on their harvest. So when we did these two reform lines, I wanted to specifically consider the world and how they have behaved in our last dispensation, the dispensation of their ploughing, and what we expect to be our relation to them in the future. So we began by comparing and contrasting, and everything was built on this model of methodology of compare and contrast. So we understood their history, their dispensation of 14 to 19, the ploughing, by comparing it and contrasting it with our ploughing. So we compared and contrasted ploughing and ploughing. And when we did that, we were able to see that there must be a 10-year history of warning. Then there must be an increase of knowledge given to a messenger, a leader who is raised up at their time of the end, 2014. There must be two streams of information, a stream that is true, a stream that is false, and there must be a division between two groups. And who are the two groups in their ploughing? Liberals and conservatives. You could title them, if we removed Trump from the equation, you could title them Michael Moore and Steve Bannon. They're symbols of two different ideologies. So we lined up Michael Moore, his movement, Steve Bannon and his movement. We traced how Steve Bannon began in 2012, 13, all leading up to 14. The beginning of the purging of the Republican Party, leading to the end of the purging of the Republican Party. So we traced all that movement of Steve Bannon. Then we went to the movement of Michael Moore. We talked about Flint, Michigan. We talked about Fahrenheit 9/11, the 10 years. Fahrenheit 11/9. 1989, when Michael Moore does his first documentary, we threaded him through our reform line. We spoke about Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, how she comes in at the time of the end. Born October 13, 1989, how she gets elected in 2018 at the same time. So these become the leadership of the Nethinims. They're leading that group that is diametrically opposed to Steve Bannon and his movement. So we focused on their ploughing. We've all seen that. We've all followed those presentations done over the last 18 months that speak about these people and what's happening to the world in this time period, the polarization of society. So we left that, then we came down to the Sunday law time period, their harvest. When we get to their harvest, we ask the question, first of all, what message do we bring to them? People had various ideas of that. Biblical only, a biblical only message not relating to external events, a prophetic message that is a mixture of the two relating to external events, prophetic plus inspiration, it's kind of, they were saying the same thing. And we asked what we're requiring of them. So some said no other requirement. So when they say no other requirement, they're saying that the message is only external events. We bring to them no message based on inspiration or Christianity. Purely external events, external I guess, an external catalyst that will divide two groups. We discussed if that's the case, if it's purely an external message, external events, do we give to them any other requirement? Some people said no. Some people said we give them all information. We require everything of them. So we don't just say practice equality, we say you have to be vegan, you have to dress right, you have to eat right, you have to, all these other requirements. Some people said we give all of those to the Nethinim, some of them we said we give none. Once we'd done that, I asked what two groups developed. And everyone pretty much unanimously said this is the division between conservatives and liberals. So when we made that conclusion, when we said this split, these two streams of information in this history of their coming out is between conservatives and liberals, we left this study and we went to the study of the deadly wound and the papacy. And we had a number of classes where we discussed, sometimes vigorously, what the healing of the deadly wound is. Does it relate at all to the papacy, or is it purely Protestantism? And most of us came to the conclusion that the healing of the deadly wound is the rising up of the papacy at the end of the world, separate and distinct from Protestantism. So if it's the papacy, people already started to have a problem with this history. And I said, leave that, just focus on this study of the papacy. We'll come back to this. Then we did the study of the counterfeit. We worked our way through 2.5 centuries of the counterfeit, from 1773, when they go into rebellion to their boss, lining that up with Israel, God's church, comparing and contrasting two churches. They went into apostasy, then they were taken into captivity, and then we trace their coming out of captivity. Modern Israel comes out in two parts. Millerite, 144,000. Modern Babylon, therefore, must come out in two parts. We traced 1798, 1899. Both of them begin that Alpha history. 1798, the Alpha history for modern Israel. 1899, the modern history of modern Babylon. First and second angels' messages did a work. First and Second World Wars did a work. The rising up of a leadership, restructuring of the inside, the giving of a prophet, Ellen White, Lucia. We traced all of that. We traced the reorganization of the Catholic Church, the organization of the Adventist Church, 1863, 1962, the Second Vatican Council. For the papacy at the end of the world, a good organization. In 1773, who did they silence? The Jesuits. The Second Vatican Council, who's bringing the message? The Jesuits. At the end of the world, who are their prophets? The Jesuits. So you can trace them through from the very beginning of our study in 1773. Then you can see the theology, the message they begin to develop around the time of the Second Vatican Council. And what does the Second Vatican Council line up with? 1863. Then they come into loggerheads. Who with? Jesuits. Who do they fight? Who restrains them? Hey, brother. Who specifically? You're right about conservatives. John Paul II. So then you have a clash between this movement with this radical message, the Jesuits, and the leadership. 1989, the whole story of 1989, that history of John Paul. 1989 internally is 1888, Jones and Wagner, radical new message coming into conflict with leadership, traditionalists. So we trace the Jesuits, John Paul II, lined them up with Jones and Wagner and, what's his name? Butler. I've Bannon in my head. All these other B's. So against the leadership, Butler. So we trace that, 1989, 1888. Then we come to our time of the end. Time of the end of the meagre history of modern Israel, 1989. How many leaders do you have at the time of the end in the history of success? 2. You have John the Baptist and Christ, born in the same year. Similar point in time. The time of the end, they're both there. You don't get all those gospel stories about the 3 wise men going to the birth of John at the time of the end, do you? It's about the second leader just as much as the first. They're both there, but John does the work first. I get that. Then we come to the Omega of modern Babylon. So how many do you have at the time of the end? 2. And we lined up Benedict, I'll call them their names for that year, Ratzinger and Bergoglio, who become Benedict and Francis. Neither of them are Pope in 2001. Instead, you're going to see the death of the leadership in 2005 and the election of Pope Benedict, the first angel. So we traced that. 2001, their time of the end. 2005, death of leadership, lining up with 9/11. And then we're back on course. So at the very beginning of, when we go back to the dispensation of Christ, what happened in the dispensation of Christ? Compared to if we were to talk about ancient glorious land, modern glorious land, what's the difference between ancient glorious land and modern glorious land? My sister, what's the difference between the two? Ancient glorious land is Israel, modern glorious land, the United States. What type of government did the ancient glorious land have? So ancient glorious land combined church and state. Modern glorious land separated church and state. That's what happened in the history of Christ. Separation of church from state. Because if you go back to Samuel, he leads Israel religiously and politically, embodied in one man. That makes sense. We saw that with Samuel, then we saw that with the counterfeit, Darius. We went to Daniel chapter 6 and we saw Darius. He is in charge of them politically. He's a king, but he wears another hat. And that hat is God. So he is God and king. And what he does as God, he cannot undo him as king. It's the story of Daniel 6. Darius as king wants to undo what he did as God, and he's not able to. Church rules the state even when embodied in one person. So you go through Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and they're this combination of church and state. So what does Satan have to do? Christ separated them. Satan separated them. When did he do that? 538. So how many years did it take him to counterfeit? 500 years. So 500 years to counterfeit. Come to Omega of modern Babylon, how many years to counterfeit? 100 years. Then we come into Omega of modern Babylon. We start off differently, 1989, 2001, but who's catching up? 2001, 2005. And then this movement trips, we reject time setting, and who gets the jump? 2013, 2014. And in that history of 2013 and 14, we're now on a collision course. We're running at the same time. So we did the history of the true, the history of the counterfeit, and we compared and contrasted them in all these different ways. Then we spoke about Benedict and Francis. We saw how 1314 Francis, his name means, what was Francis's calling? Francis of Assisi? Restructure the church. And what is he known for? My brother. Caring for the less privileged. People often talk about his relation to animals, but it was all those who were either in suffering or the poor. Essentially, what do we call that? What theology? Liberation theology. So Pope Francis chose his name wisely. And in 2013, the second angel is empowered. Pope Francis becomes Pope. 2014, he begins that restructuring of the Catholic Church. 2014, he begins stacking the College of Cardinals. How many years was, we'll have to count, was John Paul Pope for? 1978, so it's 88, 98, 08, he died in 5. So 30 minus 3, 27. John Paul is Pope for roughly 27 years. How many cardinals did he appoint? 19. In 5 years, 6 years, 6 years, how many has Pope Francis appointed? 67. So 19 in 27 years, 67 in 6 years. He's rebuilding the Catholic Church after his own mould. We spoke about how he began that in 2014 on 3 different levels. First of all, College of Cardinals. Second level. How else did he begin the work? My sister. Three different attacks Pope Francis makes against the Catholic establishment. 3 ways he starts restructuring the church that we have discussed. There might be others. We've spoken about one, how he's changed the College of Cardinals, appointing liberal cardinals, 67 of them. I want to know the other 2 that we discussed about what he's done, what he began to do in 2014. That's one element of what he does, and that's an important element, because that's how people call him a dictator. But what was the synod about? Synod on the family. So when it's a synod on the family, what's he trying to introduce? Sorry? Everything to do with a family. This one doesn't really relate to married priests. What does he do that relates to married priests, my sister? What does he do to try and introduce married priests? Synod on the family relates most closely to divorced couples, homosexuality, the role of women, but he tries to introduce married priests. The Synod of the Amazonian Synod. So in 2014 he appoints his first cardinal. He begins the work of stacking the College of Cardinals. Completes that in 2019, as far as swaying them to the majority liberal. 2014, Synod on the Family. That's liberation theology. And then the Amazonian Synod. Also liberation theology, but it has that added element of trying to introduce married priests. So we bookended this dispensation of what the second angel is doing, and who starts to oppose him? The first angel. And you have this split within the Catholic Church between those who support the first angel and those who support the second. And there are people who now have, for the first time in 600 years, another living pope they can turn to if they don't like the one who is the actual practicing pope. If they don't like Francis, they can say, he's an apostate. He's an intruder. Benedict is still the pope. So people have a choice between the leader and the former leader who is still living. And that splits internally the Catholic Church. That's how it's been since Pope Francis was elected. That entire time you've had these 2 groups. But when does Benedict start to give them a voice? Before Benedict speaks, his people speak. That is Archbishop, who knows? 2018. Vigano. Vigano in 2018 begins that attack. He begins speaking out. Internally, the Midnight Cry message is presented. Elder Jeff is silent, but his disciples are already speaking out. 2018, the true and the counterfeit. Both disciples of the first angel begin to attack the message. Then the first angel himself begins to speak. When? What month? April 2019. Benedict? 2019. April 2019, Benedict, he attacks the second leader. April 2019, Elder Jeff attacks the second leader. Couple of days apart. You come down to the final months of 2019. Now Elder Jeff begins to speak in open opposition to the message of this movement. So this movement gives a message. Elder Jeff speaks in open opposition. Final months of 2019 is the Amazonian Synod. Married priests. Pope Francis is giving his message. What does Pope Benedict do? Begins to speak in open opposition. September and October. He writes his portion of that book, now released, that attacks Pope Francis's position on married priests. September and October, Elder Jeff records presentations that attack the message of the Midnight Cry. So we compared and contrasted that history in a way that I would suggest is watertight. If people don't accept this movement and the new leadership, what Elder Jeff is having to say is that Francis and Benedict are as bad as each other. If he says that, what is he saying about this movement and him? He's saying we're good. Because if Pope Francis and Pope Benedict are as bad as each other, then he has to say that Jeff and Parminder are as good as each other. But he doesn't use compare and contrast. He doesn't believe in the watertight nature of the study of the counterfeit anymore. He used to. But he can't, because it becomes an untenable position. So we traced all that line of the counterfeit. Then we looked into the future, and based on that watertight nature, we made some conclusions. Right now, we have been through Gethsemane, through the cross, and this movement is smitten and torn. What do we know is coming prophetically? Pentecost. A binding up. This movement is a history of success. And from Pentecost to 34 AD, they did the last work for the church, and then they were a full, ready, empowered movement to take on the world. So we know that we rise, Panium to Sunday law. Whatever trouble looks like it exists now. So if we do, what about the counterfeit? They rise from Panium to Sunday law, which is exactly what we had been saying. Sunday law, in a simplistic fashion, the healing of the deadly wound. Then we went to the Third Diadochi War. The Third Diadochi War told us that whole story, but it added details. It gave evidence to the rise of the papacy, and it added details about the relationship between the papacy and the king of the north and the king of the south. Begin as friends at the time of the end, and then what happens? Friendship destroyed. Then you have all those years of tension and fighting. And then Seleucus goes and takes Babylon and sets up for a war beginning at Panium. Panium to Sunday law, who's fighting? Seleucus and Antigonus, or the papacy and Donald Trump, the United States. They fight a war. And then at the Sunday law, beginning of the Seleucid dynasty, and Seleucus goes east and he establishes his empire. So at the Sunday law, the papacy has won. It has established itself. It's healed the deadly wound, and it's going to go forward and do a work. So all of that was to show the rise of the papacy within this history, from Sunday law from Panium to Sunday law, and then doing a work for the world after the Sunday law. So we're all okay so far. That's just verbal revision. All of this, the purpose of doing all of this was to bring us down to the harvest of the world, this history of Sunday law to close of probation. And what we want to understand is what two groups are going to develop there. And we'd said conservatives and liberals. So we came back to this study that we'd left and we said, okay, so it's Francis here. Now we start to have a problem saying that the two groups are conservatives and liberals. So we went back to another compare and contrast. We went back to the priests and we saw that in the history of our ploughing, it's who? We did that more neatly on this board. Our ploughing is Elder Jeff with his movement ministry versus Adventist structure, because this is the history of Daniel chapter 2 and the stone being cut out of the mountain. So this whole reform line, the theme is the separation of a movement from the Adventist church structure, the cutting out. And at the time of the end, in this increase of knowledge, you see that begin to happen. The Adventist church structure, the mountain, as Elder Jeff and Future for America begin the cutting out of this stone. So we could, in a simplistic fashion, see this whole reform line as being just that. It's movement cut out of Adventism. But we got to the history when we're given the midnight cry and told to come out. Nearly all of us have come out in the history of 14 to 19, because that's when we're told to come out of Adventism. But what split and shaking happened in this history was not a split and a shaking between us and Adventism. Who was the split and shaking between? This movement, the new leadership of this movement, and Elder Jeff, Future for America. So when we have 5 key waymarks, the middle waymark marks the Sunday law, and on every reform line we have, at that waymark, what happens? Change of leadership. On this waymark you have John to Jesus, well before they ever go back to the church. In the history of the first of the 3 groups called out, it goes from John to Jesus. It goes from Miller to Snow, Moses to Joshua. Every one of our reform lines is consistent on that point. So 2014, there's a change in leadership. And the threat this movement faces, what splits the movement of the priests, is not this movement versus Adventism. We were already cut out of them. What splits us is the new leadership versus those who did the ploughing. We're all okay with that. So when we compared and contrasted that, we had to allow for some differences with the line of the Nethinims. The difference being that they're called to come out in their harvest, we're called to come out in our latter rain. So we briefly explained that dynamic, but I think most people are aware of why that is. We built the same structure. That means that their middle waymark, there must be a transition in leadership. Who's their leader now? Michael Moore, AOC, those leaders. They led this movement from 14 to 19. This is the story of something being beaten out, wheat being beaten out of the statue. Same parable, Daniel chapter 2. Mountain, a stone cut out. Statue, wheat comes out. So something comes out of this and something comes out of this. The mountain and the stone is in a simplistic nature the story of the reform line of the priests. Coming out of the statue is in a simplistic nature the story of a group coming out of the world. And what is the world? Trump's America. So at the very beginning you have us, this movement, Elder Jeff, versus the mountain. The very beginning you have Michael Moore versus the statue. Donald Trump's America. Then you get to their Sunday law history. And there is a transfer in leadership. And who becomes their new leadership? This movement. If we're telling them to come out and join us, We're telling them where to go and what to do. So you know we're leading them here. But we don't begin that at Sunday Law. 2014, no one in this movement knows that Elder Parminder is the new leader of the movement. They don't have to. It's marked in prophecy. It takes people a while to figure that out. No one knew in 1989 that Elder Jeff was a leader of a movement either. He didn't even know that. Doesn't matter. It's marked in prophecy. So 2014 at the Sunday Law Waymark, transfer of leadership. 2021, Sunday Law for the world, for the Nethinims, transfer of leadership. First leader, second leader. The second group of leadership is the movement. So when we get to the history when they're called to come out, it's the new leadership versus Michael Moore, AOC. Their message is formalised in September, October 2018. At the same time, the Midnight Cry is given, which begins in September and ends in October. October 2018, who does Michael Moore meet with? Pope Francis at the Vatican. And they are together. They are in unity. So Michael Moore is on whose side? Francis. So when the papacy, when Francis begins to rise in this history in power, is Michael Moore going to take our side or his? His side. So who becomes our greatest threat? Michael Moore. Elder Jeff was in this history. Michael Moore is in this history. Because the split happened within the priesthood. Adventism is long gone. The split happens within the Nethinims. Conservatives, Trump, they're already swept away. They're already gone. The split happens within the movement. And when the split happens within the movement of the Nethinims, it's between the new leadership, you and I, this movement, and modern Babylon. So the papacy, instead of being a secondary threat to Protestantism, Donald Trump's conservative America, it becomes much more serious when we consider the Nethinims in the history of their harvest, the choice they have to make. That all can sound quite neat, perhaps simple, but it begins to be a really quite loaded point when you think of how people have been treating this history, their ideas of this history in the last months, particularly since late last year. We're down here. This is us. We're here right now, just after 2019, January 2020. We've just entered a new dispensation, and people are here. They're looking at this line of the world, and based on their conclusions about this line of the world, they're making decisions about their own spiritual experience. To tackle what I'm concerned are errors in understanding their own spiritual experience, you first need to go and show to them what they're understanding wrong about the world, the reform line of the Nethinims. This is the history of their ploughing, the history of their first angel. What's the problem with the first angel? Half right and half wrong, Moses, John the Baptist, William Miller, Elder Jeff. Does any one of them understand the nature of the kingdom? No. So our problem is that this movement, external movement being ploughed by external events, their message, the message Michael Moore, AOC, others are giving, it must be half right and half wrong. And people have not understood that, or they have not behaved as if they understood that. Going back to the line of Christ, here you see the transfer of John to Christ. Does John understand the nature of the kingdom? No. Does Christ? Who does Christ represent? He represents this movement. He represents the new leadership of this movement. So the faithful of this movement and the new leadership, do they have a half right, half wrong message? Do they misunderstand the nature of the kingdom? No. And people have swapped those two. They've said, we must be half right and half wrong because we're conservatives and we think like conservatives. We have all of these issues. So we have to go to the world and understand from AOC and Michael Moore and all of these secular people what to do and how to think. Because people are saying, not directly, but they're implying, we've got all these errors and they have it all figured out. I would be quite forthright in the other way. We have it all figured out, theoretically. I know we have an increase of knowledge and all of that. We don't have a misunderstanding about the nature of Christ's kingdom. They are half right and half wrong. So we left the presentation yesterday by asking people to think, where are they half right and where are they half wrong? Because if you can't tell me where they're half wrong, you can't look to them as some type of compass about what we should think or what we should wear or what we should do. Does that make sense? Unless you can concretely identify where they are half wrong. People are looking to this model to say they have it all figured out. They're this grand political movement. We can't go to them because we have all the problems, and we're going to come into this harvest period and finally we'll have figured out all of our errors, and we all can come into some type of grand political unity. That's the type of narrative they're sharing. The problem with that is, first of all, we're the leaders, they're not. The second problem is they're half wrong. So we must have something to teach them because we are not half wrong. We're all okay so far. So people, the reason that we did the counterfeit, all of this was to tackle this history of their harvest. Sunday law to close of probation. What we think that looks like impacts the decisions that people are making right now. It impacts how people are reading the vows. Because if they have it all figured out, do they need vows about reforms? No. So we must be the ones that are wrong. We need to change. Come in line with them. Does that make sense? So I left the subject, the pregnant thought, the end of our last class. Where are they half wrong? Does anyone want to have a go on that? Share their thoughts. Where are they half wrong? Sister Elizabeth.
Well, I can point out the issue of equality. Because the way the world understands things is different from the way that we understand things. There may be no issue about equality, but not the same way.
I agree with that, the issue of equality. We think they have equality all figured out, that they have equality all figured out, and we're behind. And they're saying that by pointing to people like Beyonce and saying, look, Beyonce sings about equality, she has it all figured out. And what did we say yesterday? Line up Beyonce with her husband. Who takes care of their appearance? Who has to? If you switched what they look like, would Beyonce have any of her influence and power? No. So is that equality? No. So do they understand equality in the world? Not very well. They're able to go so far, but the minute they're looking at AOC and has a certain image, and with that image has given her a certain following and power, if she looked like Michael Moore, would she have that? No. Does he have to look like her to have a voice? No. Why? Because he's a man. So the Nethinims, the world, those are on the right side of the issue. How good is their understanding of equality in reality? Really poor. Really poor. But they have an understanding. It's only this movement that can deal with that issue in a fashion that is comprehensive. So even when it comes to equality, we tackled that. The nature of the kingdom, what's their mistake? Because it always comes down to the nature of the kingdom. My brother.
They are having this dream of an utopian society.
Utopian society. So if you don't mind, I'm going to erase this. I'll keep this one up for now. Their idea of the nature of the kingdom equals, our brother has said, a utopian society. Do you want to add to that anything? Any other details, or anyone else want to add to that? What their idea looks like? Hey, brother. So Michael Moore, what does he think the kingdom would look like? Because he's striving for some type of kingdom. He has some idea of what he wants the world to look like, and he's trying to drive this through till he structures the United States and then the world after a certain model. You could call that the nature of the kingdom. So I want to know what he thinks the nature of the kingdom is, because when we understand what he thinks the nature of the kingdom is, we know where he's wrong. Brother Rogers and then Brother Willie. Socialist society? Brother Willie, then Brother Robert. Socialist society? Brother Robert? A multipolar? A multipolar system. Anyone else? Brother. God is not acknowledged as the king. So he's trying to set up a utopian socialist society, and it's entirely secular. Is anything spiritual required of the people? Any requirement? For Michael Moore. Anyone want to add to that? So when Michael Moore, he sets up his kingdom, this utopian society, what they're trying to set up is this utopian society, completely secular, and where is it? It's on this earth. And as long as it's on this earth, do you need to give people any requirements about what they can wear, what they can eat, what religion they practice, what day they worship? Is there any requirement of religion or reform? Is Michael Moore requiring that? Does anyone say that he is? Raise your hand. Does anyone say that he isn't? I got 5 hands out of that whole exercise, so the rest of us are either confused or we're not sure. I've just confused you all. What type of kingdom is Michael Moore trying to set up? Literal earthly kingdom? It's going to be this movement of just secular society towards this socialistic utopian environment. And how are they on reforms or requirements? Do we not know? Does Michael Moore say, if you want to be part of my kingdom at the end of the world, you're not allowed to be wearing earrings? Did he say that? No. So is he asking of any reforms? No reforms. No reforms. Do we get that? So he's expecting this earthly utopia, completely secular, no religious element, no reforms. Does that make sense? So can you see why people are coming down to this history and says, well, we must be giving them a message that has no requirement? Why are they saying that? Why are they saying we give them no other requirement? And who are we believing when we say that? Why did we start saying that last year? People started saying that late last year into this year. Why?
Because we think his message is 100% correct.
Because we believe him. We're believing Michael Moore's definition of the nature of the kingdom. Can we see that? We think that, and people are going so far as to thinking that heaven is on this earth. That somehow we're going to have this secular society on earth. And that heaven is just spiritual application. So people are doing different degrees of this, but they're all doing the same thing. Can you see that? None of this existed before we started speaking about Michael Moore and what he's doing. And because we've discussed him in the ploughing time, people have looked into him. They've seen the nature of the kingdom Michael Moore is trying to set up, and they've brought that into this movement. Does that make sense? Who said no? Michael Moore has an idea of the nature of the kingdom. He believes it's on earth, that it's a secular socialist society with complete freedom from the requirement to keep any type of reforms. People never had this issue before we brought the subject of Michael Moore into this movement. People have gone back and studied him and studied this movement and all the people associated with it, and all of a sudden they're saying, we must give no other requirement to the world. We're not going to give them reform vows. Why do they need to keep our reforms? Where did they get that from? They got that from him. They got that from studying and imbibing Michael Moore's idea of the nature of the kingdom. And is he correct on this? He can't be. So we're taking the errors, the half wrong in the ploughing of the world, and bringing them into the priesthood. Does that make sense? Is anyone confused on that issue? This is the danger that we're facing increasingly since the last months of last year. And I want us to see where we've got that from. We've got that from the world. I don't mean the world in its whole sense, I mean the world in this movement of Nethinims, because their ploughing is half right and half wrong. They have all the damage of their history that they have not yet unlearned. They've barely begun. They've just been planted as a seed, and already a priest ready for harvest thinks that he has to go to them to sort out his mistakes. And their understanding of the nature of the kingdom, this model is wrong. So we understand that when we come down and we understand the message that we give them, we're telling them of a kingdom on this earth? No, a kingdom in heaven. And when it becomes a kingdom in heaven, because Elder Parminder started introducing this issue that's always about geography, when it becomes a kingdom in heaven, all of a sudden, what problem do you have? To get to there, what do you need that you don't need here? There's a list of requirements that they might not need here. But when we understand the nature of the kingdom, that it's a spiritual kingdom, that it's a kingdom in heaven, then there starts to be a list of requirements to get there. Somebody could accept equality. I could accept men and women are equal. And then I could go and kill my sister. I've just committed murder. Do I go to heaven? No, because there's a standard, a list of requirements. So I don't want to spend long on this, because there's something I want to tackle before we close. But I just want to make one point about Millerite history. If we were to talk about Millerite history, I'll erase this board. And it's on the other side in Elder Parminder's study, so I want to just remind us of that, not go through it, but remind us of that. Priest equals? Equals? So if we were to talk about our Alpha history, the history of the Millerites, we build their reform line based on 5 key waymarks. If we were to give their 5 key waymarks, what are they? 1798, what's the last waymark? 1863, this is the time of trouble. When does that time of trouble begin? 1861. So when is their Sunday law? 1850. And this one? We have 2 options. I want to suggest it's 1840, but it's irrelevant to this study. So we don't need to go into that. If we were to plot a fractal level of this, we would see that first group, and it would take us to 1844. 2019 is not on the reform line of 144,000 unless you want to come down to an increase at Boston Concord Exeter study. It's not one of the 5 key waymarks. So we could talk about April 19 but not October. That's not on this reform line. So this first group, we only see 2 groups in this study of the Millerites, by the way. I'm not sure if we need to do further investigation, but I suspect not. You only see 2 groups in a history of failure. I'm suggesting. 1798 to 1844. This is not all of their waymarks, but it brings us to their shut door of October 22. And for this first group, what's given to them? What was the message of the first group? Someone raise your hand so I know who to ask to speak up. It's the angel's message.
Yeah, the first angel's message is based on Daniel 8, 14. In 25 years, Christ will come.
Daniel 8:14, first angel's message. Midnight cry message. Day year principle. Summarize all of that in one word. Because they summarized it all in one thing. The chart. So everything is summarized onto the chart. The 1843 chart. Does that make sense? So the whole message is placed on this chart. You come down to 1850 and what are they to do? Go back to the world. What is the issue in 1850? Externally. What's the sin of America? Slavery. So this is slavery. Does Ellen White get to this history and say we're just going to give them a message on slavery? If they're right on the issue of slavery, we have nothing else to give them. It's purely secular. What does she say? We need to take this chart and what do we need to do? To do away with it? To correct it? What did they need to do in 1850? Someone raise their hand. What did they do? How? I can't hear the words when it's a wave of various voices. Stephen? By coming out with another chart. So they go back to the world with what? The 1850 chart. Do they say the testing message is slavery? So no one needs the messages of our history? Because what people are saying is, we can understand all of this stuff, we're priests, but when we go to the world, if the external testing message is equality, they don't need any of our accumulated baggage. What's the problem with that? The test was slavery, and what were they given? The 1850 chart, and on the 1850 chart is everything. So what the priests had to understand, the Levites have to understand, the Nethinims have to understand. The chart for the first group became the chart that went to the world. Does that make sense? And that is separate to the testing issue, and the testing issue was slavery. But they didn't have a message of a pure message based only on slavery. They wrote about it, they published it. Elder Paminda.
There's no slavery on the chart.
There's no issue of slavery on the chart. They were bringing to the world their prophetic message. Does that make sense? So can we discard anything that we've accumulated over the last 31 years when we go to the world? How much are they required to see and accept? Everything. We don't have time to go through it, but if you have 6,000 years of progression, God is giving light after light after light. And when we get down into our dispensation, what do we need to have? The accumulated light of 6,000 years. And when we go to the world, does that 6,000 years get put aside? They have to accept the accumulated light of 6,000 years as well. Otherwise, it's not an increase of knowledge. You're going backwards, not forwards. Does that make sense? But we use Millerite history as an example. All their prophetic understanding that opened up from 1798 to October 22 of 1844 was the same things that were put on a chart and sent to the world. At the same time, the external issue is slavery. At the same time, those who are wrong about slavery left the movement and lost their salvation. Ellen White tells us that. People lost their salvation based on how they stood on the issue of slavery. Tested them. Tested the United States, the glorious land. But to be part of the movement, they had to take the 1850 chart.
The point I wanted to make was that the testing message is not codified. And so it catches them as a surprise. That's what's happening today. We have a testing message which is not codified. Codified message is Ellen White's writing. That's the message, but it's not the testing message, and it's the same issue there.
The testing message isn't codified.
It's not on the chart. So there's a message that's testing there, which is slavery, and that comes in addition to what's actually published. So when we come to our history, we have the same dynamic.
The issue of slavery is not on the charts, it's not codified. It's separate, and we have the same dynamic.
Today it's equality, which isn't codified, and what's actually codified is the Sabbath issue, and all the rules and regulations that we have. It's exactly the same dynamic they have.
What is codified is the Sabbath and our rules and regulations. Equality is not codified. So it becomes, in some ways, a difficult test. But we can see that slavery was not codified on the charts. At the same time it separated was the external test. Equality was not codified. It's that external test, still a test. But what we take to them is the message. Does that make sense? So I want us to consider why we're going through what we're going through. I said something at the very beginning of our school. I want to bring us back to that. The question was asked, how do you know how to behave? How do you know what to do? By studying the past history on the lines. So we know how to behave based upon where we are on a reform line. Does that make sense? You know what you're supposed to do. Everything that you do is dictated by where you are on a reform line. Whether or not you're sharing the gospel with your Muslim neighbour is all dependent upon you knowing where you are on a reform line. They are what guides your behaviour in so many different ways. So I wanted us to come back to our reform line. And I wanted us to consider the issue of a priest. And if we want to understand the priesthood, what reform line are we talking about? We talked about Christ. He's born at the time of the end. He is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. 1989, 2001. 12 years. And then where is Jesus? In the temple. 1989 to 2001, you have Jesus in the temple. That's 12 years, 18 years later. How old is he? 27 AD, and he has become 30 years old. And when you're 30 years old, you become a priest. Does that make sense? 30 years of preparation and training. So in 27 AD, I'll shrink this down for room. So in 27 AD, Jesus is baptized. He's 30 years old, so he must be ready to go to work. Does that make sense? But where does he go? He goes into the wilderness. So I want us to consider where we are on our reform line. In this story, where are we? We're in the wilderness between his baptism and when he goes into active ministry. We could call it the first temple cleansing. So we know that we're in the history of Christ in the wilderness. So that should start to tell us about what we're experiencing and how to behave, yes? So I want us to look at Christ's experience here. I just want to give you a couple of quotes, just not to read them, but to pull thoughts from them. CSA 32.6. What is relevant about this quote, one of the things that I find most relevant, just in the first couple of sentences, it says, in the wilderness of temptation, the destiny of the human race had been at stake. Do you think we're in a dangerous time period? Yes. If the priests fail, what hope is there for Levites or Nethinims? So you know right now in this dispensation, in the dispensation of our harvest, there must be issues which put the whole plan of salvation, the whole line of the 144,000 at stake, the whole gospel. Does that make sense? Christ was then conqueror. Now the tempter had come for the last fearful struggle. So she's talking about Christ in the wilderness, and she compares and contrasts that through this paragraph with Christ in Gethsemane and the cross. Does that make sense? So Gethsemane and the cross, prior to this history, she's saying that Satan made his last final assault on Christ. This is the last final assault. When was the first? here. So prior to his death on the cross, he went through the final assault of Satan. So we all know that this movement has been through Gethsemane, it's been through the crucifixion, into the tomb. The final months of our dispensation were fraught with danger, yes? Shook this movement. But then she says, the first assault of Satan, which she also uses the same quote, his form was marred more than the forms of men. She uses that same sentiment to apply to the wilderness time period here. So this is an assault that puts the plan of salvation in jeopardy. This is an assault that puts the plan of salvation in jeopardy. So do any of us feel safe, like we've gone through November 9 and we're in a nice calm period now? This was danger, Gethsemane. This was danger, the wilderness. Here Christ was weak and emaciated. Here Christ was weak and emaciated. Can we see that? If you take both of them, you bring them into our experience as a movement, and you can see the danger we faced towards the end of the last dispensation and the danger that we're still in. So I want, first of all, that comes as a warning that we know that we are in a time period where we must watch and pray and consider our position carefully. I'll give an evidence for how she talks of this history in CTR 192.4. It's just in this paragraph that she says, she talks about Jesus. He was led into the wilderness to be tempted. He was led by the Spirit of God there. By fasting and prayer, he was to brace himself for the blood-stained path he must travel. She talks of this as being the final steps of preparation. So even though he's 30 years old and baptized, there was one final step in his preparation. That was the wilderness. For the movement of the priests, it's the same thing. It's our final step of preparation. Satan knew that the Saviour had gone into the wilderness, and he thought this was the best time to approach him. Weak and emaciated from hunger, worn and haggard with mental agony, Christ's visage was so marred, more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So she's quoting that passage about Jesus' visage being marred that we apply to Gethsemane and the cross. And she applies that to the wilderness. So can we see that we can place that in two different places? And when we make application, we can put it here. This last dispensation, the closing scenes of this last dispensation, this being the cross, and we can also place it here, because it's Christ in the wilderness. We're okay with that. The great leading temptations that would assail men, Christ met in the wilderness of temptation. So she's going to start breaking down these three temptations that Christ received. We'll speak of the first, and we'll go to the book of Matthew, and I want to make a point about this, how this is recorded in the Gospels, because you find it in Matthew and you find it in Luke. And does anyone know the difference between how it's recorded in Matthew and how it's recorded in Luke? They put the temptations in a different order. So if we want to understand the correct order that they went through in the actual history, we have to go to the Desire of Ages. So I'll give those references. If you were to go to the Desire of Ages, she tells us the order that those temptations came. First, Desire of Ages 117.3, and there it will tell you the first temptation is bread. Desire of Ages 129.1. She talks about the second, cast down from the temple. And the third, if we can look that up, Desire of Ages 129.1. And we'll read that. Desire of Ages 129.1. One's the wrong one. So this is 124.3. One two 9.1 says Jesus was victor in the second temptation, and now Satan manifests himself in his true character. So in the first two, he's not in his true character. In the third, he comes into his true character. He doesn't appear as hideous monster with cloven feet and bat's wings. He is a mighty angel, though fallen. He avows himself the leader of rebellion and the God of this world. Placing Jesus upon a high mountain, Satan caused the kingdoms of the world in all their glory to pass in panoramic view before him. So in this final one, the temptation is the view of the kingdoms. And it's here. The only reason that Satan can offer him the kingdoms is he's saying that these kingdoms already belong to him. So to do that, he's had to give up this pretense of being some messenger from God. He's had to show his true form as Satan. So Desire of Ages gives us the correct order of these temptations. He couldn't offer him the kingdoms until he'd thrown off his pretense, his acting. He only did that in the third. So if you go to Luke, it won't give the correct order for these. It'll go bread, then it'll go to the kingdoms, and then cast down from the temple. It switches them. So we want to go to Matthew. If you go to Matthew, starting in verse 1. Matthew starting in verse 1. Then was Jesus led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was afterward hungry. And when Satan the tempter came to him, he said, If thou be the Son of God, command that these stones be made bread. So the first temptation says, take a stone and make it bread. What is Christ's condition? He's starving, hungry. What is he hungry for? Bread. And what does a bread symbolize in the Bible? Bread of life, or the message. It symbolizes a message. If you were to go to 5T 206.3, we'll need, I'm probably out of time, so we'll need to work. I'm way over time. So I'll work through this fairly quickly. 5T 206.3, she says the third angel's message is the bread of life for a starving world. So she described that specifically as the third angel's message. But the message is the bread. How is Christ? He is starving, hungry. He has no bread. When is the last time he had bread? At the baptism. Who is Christ? Who does he represent? The movement of the priests. So I want to make application. All through the last 18 months, we've had a message, the growing midnight cry message that all of us have had trouble keeping up with. Then we come to the camp meeting in Germany. Began with World War II, closed with World War I. That whole midnight cry message bookends and closes. Then Parminder and I, through no planning, there is no school at that time and we're relatively silent. Everything goes quiet. Does that make sense? Everything goes quiet. November 9 comes around and people are all saying what? Explain to us November 9. Explain to us Raffia. Now I could have, when we started this class, I could have gone straight to this and said, no, this is the papacy and the division is between two groups. But we took 3 weeks of classes to get to that point. So I'm not going to talk about November 9 today because we would, to be honest, to start explaining last year Raffia and waymarks, we would need at least 3 weeks of more classes. I don't think giving conclusions is helpful. But people have all those thoughts. Explain to us November 9. Explain to us Raffia. And Parminder and I are silent. And in this comparative silence, people are hungry for what? They've had 18 months of the midnight cry. They're hungry for a message. And what's the temptation? Take a stone and force it to become what? A message. And what did Christ say? I can't use my power, the power given to the priesthood, to make your stone a message. Does that make sense? So in the history when it's quiet, people start to develop this idea that they have some type of stone and it's a message needed for this movement. Do we have a message right now? No, we don't. The history of the wilderness tells you that clearly. Explanations of our questions will come, but for whatever reason, whether it's Christ in the tomb or Christ in the wilderness, we are in a period where we hang on to the light God has given us, we trust in His leading, and we understand that right now He has not given to us a message. But there are people who think that they have a stone, and that stone is a message to this movement, and what is that stone that they're sharing? It's the idea of the reforming of our vows of this liberal, secular movement. Does that make sense? People believe that they have a message of liberalism to come and teach this movement. That's what is being developed and given. Elder Parminder.
We know that a stone is a symbol of the Gentiles.
Stone equals Gentiles. Bread equals message. And a stone is a symbol of the Gentiles. Do you want to explain that?
So we're being offered now a message that comes from the Gentiles, which is everything you put on that board.
We're being offered a message that comes from the Gentiles. What's Gentiles specifically? Michael Moore and his half-wrong message. So something that belongs to the Gentiles, a stone, is being given to a starving movement and saying, force this and make it bread. Does that make sense? And what's one of the ways you know that's wrong? Because the people saying that, either they say it explicitly or less explicitly. What's the pregnant thought they give with that? If you're different to FFA, if you're so different, if you're the movement, if Elder Parminder and Elder Tess are the leadership, they're going to make this stone, this liberal message, and make it bread. They're giving that thought with it. Don't know if all of us in here are aware of that, but it comes with that same thought. If you are different to FFA, you'll accept this liberal message. And that should be the first sign that something has gone seriously wrong. So we have this message of liberalism. When I say that, it comes down to those vows Elder Parminder was speaking about, the changing in our history about reforms, what God requires of us. This idea of what type of movement we're to be. All of that is being encapsulated into message, and you see that being promoted and developed. And this is taking a stone, something they got from the Gentiles in a time period when we have no message, and saying, if you're different to FFA, if you really believe in freedom, because they didn't believe in freedom, if you believe in freedom, you'll endorse this. And we don't. Comes down to the second test. What's the second test? If you go back to Matthew verse 4, first of all, 4 verse 4, Christ's response. It is written. So what does Christ go back to? Thus saith the Lord. Can you see where we're under attack already? Again, people take what we've taught, whether it's about liberalism or dress, and they've manipulated and twisted it. Not necessarily maliciously. Through misunderstanding, they've twisted it. Do we believe in a thus saith the Lord? Yes, we do. When we take methodology to it. He says, thus saith the Lord, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. On our reform line, are we meant to have a message right now? I want to change it, thus saith the Lord, to something that I feel like is an exact equivalent. Thus saith the line. Do we have a message right now? No. Go to the next temptation. Matthew chapter 4 verse 5. Then the devil taketh him up into the holy city, and setteth him on a pinnacle of the temple, and saith unto him, If thou be the Son of God, if you're really different, cast thyself down, for it is written, He shall give His angels charge concerning thee, and in their hands they shall bear thee up, lest at any time thou dash thy foot against a stone. So Satan has learned a lesson from the first temptation. What does he change in the second? He's going to give him back, it is written. He's going to give him back a quote. And he says, this says, God will take care of you. If you come to harm, God will send His angels to protect you. So the second says, cast thyself down, and God will protect. What does Ellen White call that? Ellen White summarizes that up and calls that presumption. We're out of time, so we won't go back through that, and it's not my study to do that as well as it should be anyway, but I want to remind you of what Elder Parminder's taught about the nature of man. So what people are saying is essentially this. Do you have to cast yourself down from the temple? To not cast yourself down, if I was to say, don't cast yourself down, am I giving you law or good advice? I'm giving you good advice. I'm saying, I'm going to give you good advice, don't cast yourself down from the temple. So I'm giving good advice. We all agree on that. If you don't follow that good advice, what's going to happen? Satan says, no consequences. You don't need to follow the good advice. So people are saying, we could go through those quotes. Beyonce believes in equality. I can listen to her music. It passes the test. We know it's all about the external events. We don't need no 1850 chart. Beyonce believes in equality. I can listen to her music and feel no consequence. I can wear earrings and no consequence. I can eat eggs if I choose to. It's only good advice, and there will be no consequence. Can we see that? Doing something that God has said don't do, it will hurt you, and thinking we're not going to suffer consequences. That's the sin of presumption. Does that make sense? So there is good advice that says don't cast yourself down, because if you do, you are placing yourself in a position where there will be consequences, and will God protect you from the consequences? No. And when we looked at the nature of man's study, what are the consequences? You go back to what Elder Parminder taught about the outer man and the inner man. If people are watching videos and haven't followed up with those, they should. As Elder Parminder said, without planning, our studies have supported each other, that they become inseparable. So this is the sin of presumption. It says, I can adorn, listen to music, watch worldly movies. If they have some semblance of a message of equality, I can wear makeup. I can do all of these things with no consequences. Because they're only good advice. That's essentially what people are saying. And Jesus says, it is written, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God, because will God protect you? No. There are consequences. Come down to the third. Then the devil taketh him up into the holy city and setteth him on a pinnacle of the temple. Down. Verse 8. Again the devil taketh him up into an exceedingly high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them, and says unto him, All these things will I give you, if you will fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said unto him, Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. So in the third, Satan offers him the kingdoms of this world. What is Satan offering him? What is Satan offering him? Kingdoms of this world? I'm looking for that rephrased. A utopian socialist society where there is no requirements of reforms. Does that make sense? He's got it wrong geographically. Where does Jesus say his kingdom is? In heaven. Satan is saying, I'll give you a kingdom on earth. I'll give you a kingdom where you're going to be this political movement with secular power, where people have none of these troublesome requirements or reforms. Does that make sense? He's saying kingdoms of this world, if we take that concept, I'm saying this is Michael Moore's half wrong concept. When he misunderstands the nature of the kingdom, the fact that they think it is this earthly secular society that's being raised up, that somehow we're going to join and become a force for good with, without bringing to them a spiritual message, all of the requirements, all of the increased light that we find in all of our vows. Does that make sense? So when we understand where we are on a reform line, we're understanding. I had included quotes here about music just because she has, but we could do any of these subjects. We could talk about jewelry and earrings. Here, if we had time, I'd include quotes about music, and she says what that does to our brain. And it is this idea that we can place ourselves in harm's way with no consequences and God will protect us. When we have clear stipulations that these external things, whether it's jewelry, earrings, makeup, what we eat, what we listen to, what we watch, that somehow that doesn't affect us spiritually. So when we think of where we are in a reform line, and that's to tell us how to behave, we understand that we went through a shaking, a difficult, painful history leading up to our close of probation, November 9. What I want to suggest is that if you use the lines of Christ, the suffering he went through in Gethsemane, Ellen White lines up with the suffering in the wilderness, and we have no time to be complacent and feel that we're in a position of safety. As a movement, we know that it's a history of success. But God can do that with as few or as many people as choose to be part of that movement. So individually, we need to be aware of the danger that we're in. What I'm saying is that this misunderstanding about the line of the world, about the dangers or the test in their harvest period, not between conservatives and liberals, but between a true liberality and a counterfeit liberality, is what will separate in that time period. The problem is we have been bringing into the movement, people have been imbibing counterfeit liberality, counterfeit liberalism, and passing that off as true liberalism because they think we're half wrong, and Michael Moore and their ploughing history, they have these things figured out. We looked at where they are half wrong. The nature of the kingdom they're trying to set up. what they expect of people. And then we went to the history of Christ in the wilderness. If those are the three temptations he faced in this history, you know they're the three temptations that every one of us in this movement faces. Are we taking a message that comes from the Gentiles, their error from the stone, and trying to make it food for us because we're hungry? Some are. Are we thinking that we can do all of these things which God advises us not to do, and somehow there are no consequences and we will be protected? That's the second temptation. The third temptation is about the nature of their kingdom. Do we want the kingdom that they're wanting to set up in their half-wrong idea of the first angel? Or do we understand that God raised up the priests to set up a different type of kingdom? And that in this history, we are not half wrong in our understanding of that. We are 100% correct, and the world has nothing to teach us. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So this ends my final class with you. I want us to consider some of the risks that we're in. When we come down to a reform line, 2012, 2014, says the formalization of a message on what subject? Time. You come down to 2018. Elder Jeff here, did he accept time? No. Over here, does he accept time? Yes. Did it do him any good? Why? It was too late. It was too late. By the time it came into this history, the door had already shut. So that sounds doom and gloom. It is. I don't think it has to be that hopeless. Was he part of the movement that entire history? So it took him 7 years to leave, yes? In 2012, it's already a done deal. So we leave with two warnings. First of all, this is a message of equality. And then we come down here into 2020. First point I want to leave you with is just because people seemed to accept the message of equality, many of us haven't. We claim to accept it, we don't practice it, we don't live it. When it's pointed out to us, we don't like it. And is that actual acceptance? So does being part of the movement for 7 years give you any comfort? No. I don't enjoy arranging people's lives or interfering. But think for yourself whether or not you understand the message of equality and whether or not you're practicing it, because it hasn't stopped being life and death. You may think that you passed it. If you're not practicing it, if you're not properly understanding it and practicing it, if you're not liking when it's pointed out to you and being reminded of it, if you think it's fine to excuse sexism, you can give 7 years, you're a dead man walking. Elder Jeff was. That dynamic has not changed. It's just a risk with the formalization of that message as it was in 2012. I want to leave us with that thought, not to depress us, but to warn us, because it's life and death. The same time people are battling with that subject of equality, we have these three temptations to face. And we're in much danger with this as we were in the last months of 2019. We have to be careful that we understand the world and our relationship to it correctly. Only by doing that can we be safe to understand who we are. And while we see Christ the movement smitten and torn both before and after November 9, we know that it's a history of success. What I want is that all of us are part of that history. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you, Lord, for your lessons, for the good advice that you give us. Lord, we know that we're in a dangerous time period, so much as life and death. I pray, Lord, that we will have that dedication to follow you wherever you go, whatever you require of us. Please work with us, Lord. Do not yet give up on any individual. May we work for the salvation of souls, for our brothers, for our sisters. I pray, Lord, that we'll have that dedication to service. Thank you for these reform lines, for what Jesus suffered, that he in so many ways can teach us who we are to be, how we are to be practicing, that he lived all these things out and suffered, Father, so that we can understand. While we never suffer as he did, Lord, we can learn from him. I pray that we will have that dedication, that we won't be driven for power or for glory or for counterfeit freedom, but that we will understand your character and strive for that instead. Please be with all these people and through the remainder of the school, continue to lead and guide. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.